Suva. Welcome, welcome. Such an honor to have you with us this afternoon. Just a brief background on some of our house rules of this webinar. Please, the participation link will be put into the chat box. If you want a certificate of participating in today's webinar, please click onto the participation link that will be shared by either Marcella or Ms. Talidau on our chat box. Click onto that, fill in your details, and by the end of this webinar, you will get a certificate for participating and attending this webinar. Secondly, for questions, beside the chat box, there's a Q&A box. If you have any questions, please come into the Q&A section, put in your questions in there, and it will be asked after our two speakers. Our guest speakers will finish their presentation for this afternoon. Thirdly, AIS and UNDP are hosting a startup weekends. For more information, I will ask Ms. Talidau to leave her contact in the chat box, and you can contact her to ask more information about the AIS UNDP startup weekends. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome everybody from across the Pacific, from across the world. Welcome to the UNDP AIS forum. Just a brief background. The aquaculture in the Pacific, as our two speakers for this afternoon will be speaking upon. Well, in the South Pacific region, there are people living in scheduled areas, and only mode of transportation to the mainland is by boat. So these islands must become fishermen or farmers to take care of their families. Fish from the islands are often shipped to major cities and within the mainland for profit. The population for these remote communities continue to grow. During COVID-19, many islands, especially in Fiji, are affected and no choice but to return to their villages because of the rise in unemployment. We are seeking strategies. AIS and UNDP work in collaboration together to seek strategies on how to assist and help islanders to preserve their way of life and also having food security. Innovations in aquaculture that will be addressed by Dr. Choili Ritayaki and a very expert speaker from SPC, Mr. Jamie Whitford, who's a mariculture specialist, that will be talking more on the topic that I just addressed to you this afternoon. And there are three objectives that will be discussed during the presentation. One is creating a stronger bond between AIS countries through sharing information on the AIS thematic areas. Number two is enhancing connections in private sector and in the intergovernmental space so that stakeholders can formulate plans to implement aquaculture projects and workshops. And thirdly, and lastly, increasing awareness among the youths about the AIS Forum, as well as on issues related to sustainable consumption of food and how ocean farming and seaweed farming can take away the burden from our environment. So without further ado, I would like to share with everyone our program for today. Firstly, we will have our first speaker, which is Mr. Jamie Whitford from the Mariculture Specialist SPC in the Cook Islands. And then we will give some time to our second keynote speaker, which is Dr. Choili Ritayaki, who is an associate professor at the University of the South Pacific. He's also the director for the International Ocean Institute of Pacific Islands and co-chair of the Korea South Pacific Ocean Forum. And we will ask you if you can just hold your questions, type it into the Q&A box, which is below and right beside the chat box, and it will be addressed after our two speakers have spoken, okay? And we will, our time frame will be within 1 to 1.5 hours. Then we'll have closing statements from our two speakers, and I will say a closing statement as the moderator of this webinar. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Jamie Whitford to the platform. Thank you, Mr. Jamie Whitford, for your time and for the topic that you will be addressing, the Pacific Islands, who are in dire need of your area of expertise. The platform is yours. Vinaka.
Thank you kindly, Salote. I talk to you now from Aitutaki in the Cook Islands, so kia rana to everyone. Apologies if my video and sound get a bit chopped up because the internet is, I'm just running off my mobile phone at the moment, but we'll give it a go. A commodity that's of interest to the Pacific Islands, which is seaweed. But I'm willing also to talk about the opportunities of other commodities that are interested and have been trialed in the Pacific quite a bit. Again, my focus is on aquaculture, and so the farming of the ocean and food production systems that we can done in the sea. But really aquaculture, most of the production actually comes from freshwater. And so production systems that involve aquaculture are actually freshwater farming, particularly catfish and tilapia that many people will be familiar with around the Pacific. But seaweed is interesting for me, and so we'll focus on seaweed. But of course, I'm willing to take questions on everything else. Unfortunately, I won't be able to run my presentation here, so I've asked the moderators to run it from Fiji, and so we'll begin with the presentation. So if you would share the screen, and I'll just bring up my notes, excuse me. So the Pacific region, ocean farming, and again, as I said, the focus will be on the seaweed industry. So we'll get right into it. The next slide, please. Pacific Ocean farming at the moment around the Pacific is including seaweed farming. Giant clam farming is also conducted in many countries. Mainly at the moment, the giant clam farming makes most of its money from the aquarium trade, but it is also a valid food production system. Pearl oyster farming is the major aquaculture industry in the Pacific. Many people will be familiar with Fiji pearls and, of course, the success of French Polynesia and the Cook Islands of making money. But now we turn to using pearl oysters in Fiji for food because we have an abundance from hatchery production. There's an interest also in rock oysters or grove oysters. It's a very similar production system. There have been many trials in the Pacific over more than 100 years of trying to rear rock oysters, I call them. There's two genuses that are involved, Secostria and Crossostria. But yeah, it's also something that SPC is trying to reinvigorate at the moment. Milkfish have been cultured in the Pacific for a long time, for millennia really. People have stocked milkfish into coastal ponds and inland ponds, but there are increasing efforts now in trying to establish commercial milkfish production at a more intensive level in several countries, including Kiribati and Tuvalu. Mainly this fish has boomed in its production in Southeast Asia, and so we still have hopes that milkfish production will be quite valuable to the Pacific. There are high value marine finfish being found in the Pacific, in French Polynesia, in the Marshall Islands, and in New Caledonia. Previously, several other countries have also been involved and require quite a high investment, but it is something that several countries are interested in. Saltwater prawn farming has been dominated in the Pacific by New Caledonia, but there have been several efforts in other countries as well to establish that. There are many other efforts as well, but these are the main ones that capture my attention at the moment. And so many of these species also in production systems tend to cross over. And so, yeah, many governments are involved in research and development work on multiple species and some new species. Next slide, please. As I said, I'd like to really just focus on seaweed production at the moment, and I'll talk about how seaweed production can be a precursor to other production of marine commodities in the Pacific at the end of my presentation. Seaweeds in the Pacific are cultured and harvested from the coastlines of many Pacific islanders, both for food and fertilizer, but also for an export industry that involves some of the components, some of the biological components of seaweed for food production overseas and some medicine production. Many communities in the Pacific are relying on this production for significant proportions of their income. But again, I think there can be more production of seaweed to incorporate this commodity into domestic markets and into local diets. So we'll see a little bit of the advance in the Pacific on that soon. Production is fragmented across the Pacific Island regions, and so there's no regional approach to it. And so that tends to break up what's happening quite a bit. We can see from the graph that Solomon Islands is currently dominating production, and we'll talk about why that's happening. A lot of it has to do with government support, but the other countries that have been heavily involved include the Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Kiribati, and Fiji. Australia and New Zealand don't actually produce much seaweed. And they import quite a bit, but I'll talk about their production as well, just out of interest. Improvements on the production systems would involve trying to make the seaweed stock more resilient to some of the climate change issues that are happening, because that seems to be the thing that is causing some of these variations in productions. For interest, Kiribati, I've only shown the production from 2010, but previous to that, in the early 2000s, Kiribati was producing, I think, over 120,000 tons of seaweed for export market. But then, yeah, their production has gone down a little bit. So in contrast to some of the global trends, seaweed production has come up in most of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia. Pacific production has tended to decrease a little bit. So we'll talk about the reason of that as well. I guess some of the variation in production can be kind of held against people's opportunity costs, we call it. And so people are involved in seaweed production when the price is good, but they have other interests as well. And so when the price of seaweed falls or the demand is not so high, there's competition from other commodities that are actually terrestrial commodities. In the case of Kiribati, it would be copper production. I imagine in Fiji and the Solomon Islands for gardening and things like kava. And so when people see that their efforts can go into other activities that would make them more money, then production seems to go down a little bit. But seaweed has other values besides money for the Pacific Islands, and so it's nutritious eaten for many, many generations. And so we're trying to do a little bit of work now in making sure people know the nutritional value of this traditional food is quite high. And so domestic markets tend to capture our attention now, although we have been involved in trying to get export markets going for the last 20 years. But now we find that domestic markets in the Pacific are increasing in their capacity, and they have interest in seaweed production that may change species, that we can get domestic markets a little bit more interested in that. I'll just go to the next slide, please. So again, as I see, Capophycus is something you might have heard referred to as cotton eye. It's a seaweed that's produced for extracting some chemicals, carrageenan, or colloids are extracted from this seaweed, and then they're involved in the production of things like yogurts and jellies and all those kind of jelly. But again, as I mentioned, the prices vary quite a bit. And so there has been a decline, but there is still an interest, and there's still a core group of people in Kiribati and Fiji that still grow this commodity, but they're limited because of their lack of market access. And of course, this seaweed is not particularly useful for domestic consumption because we don't have the infrastructure to manufacture this kind of food. And so, yeah, Capophycus is definitely an export crop. In the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea, there's been quite a bit of growth that's been supported by the government. And so when there's a government subsidy or some technical support from the government, the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea have put quite a bit of effort into that recently. And so their production is actually increasing. The Calopa or sea grapes, Rimu in the Cook Islands, Namu in Fiji, many other names I'm sure, is of course something that many of you in Fiji, and so it's a staple in the markets, I believe, at the moment. And so Calopa production for food has been a wild fishery in many countries. But now we're trying to support aquaculture attempts for Calopa, but that's mainly directed, as I said, towards domestic consumption. So we're trying to get that going as much as possible. Mazuka is a type of seaweed that's very popular in Japan, that does exist across the Pacific. It's also a type of seaweed. Mazuka farming in Tonga is actually increasing. A lot of that depends on value adding, and it's directed to the tourism market in Tonga, but also to the export market in Japan. And so another species that's quite valuable. Again, these fluctuations and decreases, successes, struggles, a lot of them are around supply chains, particularly for the sale of the product. And so they're very delicate in the Pacific and critical. And so people might spend quite a bit of effort getting their seaweed production going okay, but it still seems that both the market itself, through the buyers of the seaweed, and also the governments involved and SPC and regional organisations against these problems that they face. For instance, in Fiji, there were 3 companies buying dried Capophycus for export in the early 2000s, but now there's only a sole trader. And so if we don't have competition between companies domestically buying the product, then the price will fall. Cyclones also have affected production in many countries. And yeah, ocean farming in general is quite vulnerable to cyclones. And so we're involved in trying to make systems more resilient to these kind of natural disasters. It's interesting, in Fiji, we've been in contact recently with a sole trader, so he needs more seaweed. And so there is a market there, but as I said, the price is something that needs to be, I guess, bolstered by a bit of competition for some other buyers. The Solomon Islands also suffers from this, so there's a lack of local buying agents and the domestic supply chain for the simple things that you need for seaweed farming, which is the actual cuttings of the seaweed itself, but some ropes and for tying some strings for tying the seaweed on, and also getting your product back to the central markets in Honey Island. Means that, yeah, people lose interest when they have supply chain problems. PNG has had some success with farmers forming clusters and groups And so then they get some economy of scale for the delivery of some of the supplies of equipment that they need. And so SPC, of course, is very interested in trying to bring people together into communities or into associations, business associations. And so we can get small suppliers supporting each other to get some of the benefits that larger suppliers would have. But yeah, government and donor support is still critical for all Pacific Island production of seaweed. Next slide, please. I put this in quickly. Australia and New Zealand also produce seaweed, but not very much. And a lot of it is actually a wild fishery. Although, interestingly, Australia and New Zealand import a huge amount of seaweed for domestic consumption. And so we also need to do better. I'm an Australian to demand. And so there is an increasing demand for seaweed around the region. And yeah, it's just trying to sort out some of these supply chain problems, or to try and make sure the domestic price is suitable for the cost of in Australia and New Zealand on species that are endemic, things like dairy and beef cattle production. This type of seaweed that we're interested in there can be placed into feed to reduce methane production. But again, the Australian and New Zealand industries are like the Pacific, they're quite small and fragmented, but the Australian New Zealand industries have a bit more research capability, and so hopefully some ideas that are progressed in these countries might be useful for Pacific Island states. Next slide, please. So we talk a little bit about this diversification in seaweed production. In Fiji and Samoa, there's been quite a bit of fishing pressure on calopa or sea grapes, and some environmental conditions also have caused the calopa to not be as productive as it has been in the past. But there is a demand for calopa, and so we have culture trials in conjunction with the governments of Fiji, Samoa and Niue to try and see if we can aquaculture calopa and try and increase its try and allow the domestic market to access calopa and try and make it more popular for people in these countries and also other countries where it may not be consumed so much. There are low technology culture methods that have been introduced in some countries, and so they're appropriate for small stakeholders like communities or villages or individuals to start trialing and start growing this product and farming it instead of just relying on nature's abundance or lack of. And so, yeah, we hope that calopa will become a staple of many diets in the region. Mazuka, again, endemic in Tonga and probably in the wider Pacific, is something that it can be eaten locally and is eaten locally in Tonga. I'm not sure about any other Pacific islands. The species name is Cladocyphon ocamaranus. But yeah, I'll try and dig out some local names before we have the questions. The Mazuka in Tonga is quite interesting. It's a private sector development. There is a Japanese man who is living in Tonga now, and he is now working in conjunction with several villages because he has connection with this international market. He has been interested in producing the Mazuka seaweed. He has quite a good processing facility where he can produce dried seaweed, and he can package it. And yeah, he's accessing both the domestic market, particularly the tourism market, but also export markets. And so yeah, there are things that we can do with some of these seaweeds that are growing locally that have been part of the Pacific Island countries' diets for a long time. It's also interesting, many seaweeds and in fact many marine animals have novel compounds that are good for our health that we don't really know about yet. And so there is a donors to look at what we call bioprospecting for compounds inside some of these seaweeds that might be of some use for medicine and our health. And so it's only going to get better because we'll find some things and seaweed will be more and more into demand. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit at the start about community Ficus or cottoneye, the export crop that most people are familiar with, particularly in Kiribati and Fiji, Solomons and Papua New Guinea. It competes against copra often. And so for instance, in Kiribati copra production, the government there has made a decision to subsidise the price of copra, and so people will turn away from seaweed farming and then go to copra because again the opportunity cost is higher for seaweed than it is for copra. This comes back to the domestic price and trying to have some competition amongst the buyers in each country. So participation really still requires this trader support to try and keep ships stable as well. Again, Calopa, it's a good domestic market in Samoa and Fiji, and I'm sure many other countries that I'm not aware of. So Calopa is a bit harder to grow than the Ficus, but being able to access a domestic market is something that we find quite useful in the commodity at the moment. Yeah, we think that some of these edible seaweeds, yeah, we put more effort into that. Mainly to improve people's livelihoods and their health. Having said that, the return of Ficus farming and the export market would have a large economic benefit in the Pacific Islands. It has in the past, and so when the price has been appropriate and the production and the supply chain and value chain is working quite well, then people have made decent amount of money and improved their livelihoods from this crop. There are other things that are interesting that kind of affect the seaweed production. For instance, sea cucumber fisheries, when they're depleted in the picks, people tend to turn to seaweed farms. But then when the beach demurre fishery or sea cucumber fishery is opened again, people will abandon their seaweed farms and then go back to the activity that's making them the most money. And so this makes sense to me. Anyone would do it. And so when you're in an isolated village and you're trying to pay your school fees and everything like that, you're going to turn to the best thing. And so it's up to regional organisations and particularly governments to try and keep the economics of these commodities stable so people can get a return on their investment and keep building on it. When people tend to abandon seaweed farming, there's a lot of problems with available. Many commercial businesses in supplying the components needed for seaweed farming. And so we still need to support people and give them access to the components that they need. There are some environmental effects as well. And so in Kiribati, there has been bad years of production that are strongly correlated with El Nino. The reversal of the normal wind direction blows into the open side of the lagoons and the seaweed farms get ruined by the sea itself. It's interesting in seaweed farming, the participation of women is quite high in seaweed farming, from wild harvest to market sale.
I'm sorry,
and
but
particularly with calopa, I think, and so yeah,
Mr.
seaweed
Jamie Whitford,
tends to be
you were
something that,
breaking.
and often have quite a bit of experience with, have some knowledge about some of these commodities. But, oh, okay, yeah, my. Oh, oh, am I audible at least? Should I stop my video?
You're okay now. Just
Yeah,
repeat
and
the
so I've just stopped.
last two sentences.
Just
The
stopped
last two
my.
sentences.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll repeat
Thank
that,
you.
and I've just stopped my video. So the participation of women is quite high. And so it's quite something we're quite interested in trying to get people who often aren't represented, very well in the fishing community. And so we find seaweed farming is quite valuable for women's participation. And again, the economic benefits of seaweed farming are quite high. Mainly given the relatively low gross domestic product of many Pacific islands. And so even if seaweed farming is giving a small contribution to the economy, it can have quite a large impact. Next slide, please. I'll just mention quickly the Pacific community activities. And so we are helping many countries with national aquaculture strategic plans, and seaweed is often a priority commodity for many countries. Seaweeds do have pests and problems, and so we're doing on-site management training of some of the pests of seaweed in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. We're looking at heavy metal testing in some countries and helping them out just to make sure that the commodity produced from aquaculture is nutritious and not detrimental to people's health. We are, yeah, the chair of the Global Seaweed Board, so we have some global input, and we have interaction with particularly Southeast Asia, where seaweed production is quite large. We help with the risk assessment of new strains of seaweed that might be introduced from overseas into the Pacific Islands. As I mentioned, we're trying to explore calopa culture. We're looking at seaweed value adding in the Solomon Islands, and again, trying to replicate some of the work that's been done in Tonga to make sure that the product is presented very well in the market, or maybe the product can be packaged and presented to the tourism market. And we also help farmers with financial literacy and business basics. And again, helping with policy development and product development in a couple of countries there. Next slide, please. So again, we'll just look at the challenges of this one commodity. So Capophycus is competing against established production. It's difficult with supply chain in the Pacific. What I mean by established production is Capophycus production in the Pacific Islands competes against Capophycus production in Southeast Asia. When they're producing a lot in Southeast Asia, the price, because it's an international commodity, may go down. And so it's difficult for the Pacific to compete against Southeast Asia. Again, alternative livelihood opportunities that we mentioned, copper production, any other kind of agriculture, particularly on land, tends to reduce the interest. Calopa, the fishery is under pressure, and so and to make sure that it's visible in the market and still of interest of people. There are several new species, possibly many that are endemic in the Pacific, that could be available, particularly for what I mentioned with this bioprospecting for novel compounds, cancer, things for old age. There are many species in the Pacific region that may have huge benefits for people's health. And so we hope to keep working on some of the detailed science required for that. And then the other problem is that we need to establish centres for nursery production of seaweed to make sure cuttings and the things that we need to begin seaweed farms are available to many people in isolated areas. So again, government support or market support from the people who are buying the seaweed, or donor support and SPC support are quite important for that. And so the way forward we see for this particular commodity is to reconnect with the buyers who have been interested and try and talk to them, so we can try and keep it as a private enterprise as much as possible, because we know governments need to support many things. There is the possibility to develop edible seaweed hatchery production and nursery culture, so we make the availability of seaweed a little bit better for people to start their farming. And again, try and discover new products from traditional seaweeds that many people might eat already, and strengthen domestic markets. And so that's the effort for this particular commodity. One thing I will mention on this, which is my final slide, is that seaweed, familiar with it, tends to be just some infrastructure in a lagoon or coastal area close to a village where we string some lines. Often in many countries, the lines are held off the bottom just with stakes or sticks. Some countries do floating culture. But if you establish this infrastructure, it's also possible to start growing other commodities on the infrastructure, and then generate what we call a multi-trophic aquaculture system, where we might grow things like seaweed, but we could also use the same infrastructure to grow things like rock oysters, as I mentioned in the first slide, or even pearl oysters. There are many, particularly bivalves, that can be established on these seaweed farms as well, to create a bit of diversification at a small scale that might help people when the price goes down, or if they eat too much seaweed and get sick of it. So once infrastructure is established and people get used to working in the lagoon, there are other commodities that can be added to their repertoire. And so that's something that we're hoping to explore in Fiji at the moment, but other countries as well, particularly when COVID restrictions are raised, to get some of these multi-trophic, multi-species, I guess, ocean gardens going next to communities in various Pacific Island countries. That's all I've got. Thanks very much. Sorry that I broke up so much, probably, but I hope that you heard most of what I had to say. Thank you kindly.
Meitaki, Mr. Jamie Whitford. For the latecomers that came in late, a little bit late before I introduced our speaker, that was Mr. Jamie Whitford, who was our first speaker. He's the mariculture specialist at the Pacific Community, the SPC, and he is situated at the Cook Islands. Meitaki, sir. And from what I've gathered, despite the commotion with COVID-19, this pandemic, with that first presentation, it's giving us ideas that we cannot only utilize the land, we can also go plant in the sea and get extra cash. So everybody pay attention, let's go planting. And just the details for the ones that have missed out, I will just go through 3 reminders. First one is the participation link that was forwarded by Ms. Tali Dobel. It's in the chat box, not the Q&A box. It's in the chat box. So if you want to receive a participation certificate for this webinar, click onto that link, fill in the details that you're required to fill, and you will automatically get a participation certificate after the webinar. Secondly, questions is to be addressed in the Q&A box, which is beside the chat box. in the Q&A box, yeah, not the chat box. So if you have any questions, please submit it through the Q&A box, and we will be addressing those questions after the two speakers have spoken on their presentation. Lastly, AIS and NDP are hosting a startup weekends, and for more information, you can kindly contact Ms. Talida Rao, and she will submit her contact details, her email, for you to get extra information. If not, you can always go back to the AIS social media pages for more information. Without further ado, let me welcome the second speaker for tonight, Dr. Choweli Vitayaki, who is the director for the International Ocean Institute Pacific Island and co-chair of the Korea South Pacific Ocean Forum. Bulbenaka, sir, the floor is yours. My apologies, Dr. Choweli. Your mic is muted. Pinaka.
Can you hear me now?
Right, loud and clear, sir.
Yeah, good evening to you all, and it's a pleasure to be with you today to talk about this very important topic. And I would like to to reiterate all the interesting things that Jamie has shared with us. I'm going to go perhaps the other way and discuss some of the reasons why aquaculture in general is important for us in the Pacific Islands. We live in islands, and we have often limited land to share. But here we have the ocean, and the ocean is getting overexploited in a lot of areas, and we now have to rely on the science, the scientific information, such as the ones that Jamie has shared, to make better use of the ocean space that we have. Can I have my slides, Tali, please? Okay, so basically, I'm making the argument that aquaculture, even though there's a lot of challenges, as we have just heard from Jamie, I feel that it can still provide potential solutions for a lot of the challenges that we now face. As I was mentioning before, whether the challenge is related to the fact that we are becoming too efficient and have used up most of our fisheries resources. Even with Kaulepa or Nama in Fiji, as Jamie has mentioned, there is now concern about the sustainability of that particular resource. So I think there is ground for science to come in, and for our experts in the area of fisheries and marine biology and aquaculture and mariculture to play a more active role in doing the necessary research to then provide good advice to our governments and our communities. But going back to the point that I had mentioned earlier, I think there are 3 points that I regard as challenges. Can you please get the next slide? The main challenges, in my view, that need to be addressed are firstly that we need to sustain the fisheries resources of the Pacific. We have become so efficient in our fishing activities that the resources are getting depleted, and in some cases, like with turtles and sharks, some of the species are already under threat of extinction. So we need to do aquaculture in order to maintain the fisheries resources, whatever we can we can make it to be wherever we are in the region. The second point is that we now need to rehabilitate depleted and degraded marine habitats. Aquaculture has to be conducted in a healthy environment, and unless that environment is healthy, the hope that we have in going into aquaculture, whatever the commodity, may not be realized because we're dealing with an environment that is not providing the kind of environmental service that the products that we are farming require. Third is the need to provide new source of livelihood for our people. This reason has been mentioned in a lot of previous cases where our governments have tried to encourage support for aquaculture, but again, there are other very interesting issues that have posed difficulties along the way. As Jamie has mentioned earlier, people would be farming seaweed until the price of something else becomes better, and they abandon their seaweed farm and move to so Pacific Islanders still have that kind of freedom to move about from one sector to another, and that is a challenge for sustaining an industry that we're trying to set up. The third and the fourth and the last point is actually more like a positive point, and that is that there have been lots of studies and research, wonderful research undertaken in the Pacific on different kinds of marine and freshwater species. These resources have been adequately studied. In many of the cases, their life cycles have been closed, which means that these species can now be raised in an artificial environment outside of where they normally naturally are found, and that the production technology, even to the level of say the amount of money that you require to set up a seaweed farm, those things are already available. What we now need is what I hope a lot of you would be interested in doing, and that is to become agents of change, where you do your research and find what the best option that you have in terms of the commodity that you're going to farm, and then the prices and all of that, and then try and share that information with the people in the place where you would like to do your farming, just so that you can have that wider base to provide support for the request for other kinds of to allow you to ask for other kinds of assistance. Next slide, please. Okay. In order to set up successful aquaculture operations, there are some requirements. These requirements include the need to have, like as I was saying earlier, for people, hopefully that would include you and institutions, governments, non-government organizations, development agencies. They need to commit to introducing available aquaculture technology to people in our countries that would stand a very good chance of succeeding with the aquaculture thing. And I'm emphasizing the point that the communities to which these initiatives are introduced to, we have to be level with them. When we introduce the proposal for involvement in aquaculture development, we should have total confidence that what we are asking the people to commit to is going to be successful, because we have done the necessary research. So that's why it is important, really important, for government agencies, development agencies to be involved, because we would need the resources to help the people who are interested in getting involved. The second point is that government, as I said earlier, has tried on a number of occasions to use aquaculture as a strategy to generate employment in rural areas. Just imagine some years ago, seaweed farming was introduced to Onoi, and it was very popular amongst the islanders there, because it's a commodity that allowed them to have some economic activity. The commodity is light after it has been processed, it has been sun-dried, and it can be baled and then shipped off to the market, unlike other things like fish and things that are perishable and would not last the journey. So it is important to recognize the role of government in this regard, and the hope is that government would also continue to provide the necessary support that is needed for people to realistically get into to aquaculture. Third point is to promote appropriate technology for villages that are interested in commercially important activities that can certainly generate income even from outside. And I think in that regard, Jamie again had talked about market openings outside of the Pacific. So it is important that appropriate technology is introduced, and I think that was one of the reasons why seaweed was so popular around the rural areas, because a lot of people saw it as being quite relatively straightforward, and there was no need for huge and expensive equipment and so on. So that was one of the reasons for the popularity amongst our people on this subject of seaweed farming. And you know, the seaweed farming was also made popular by the understanding people have that it can allow villages to be engaged in an activity that does not really uproot, or they are basically change totally the way they organize their lives in villages. So the point there is that it actually can be done effectively by villagers living in the village, but then it would provide regular income to allow them to meet their other needs and aspirations. Next slide, please. So basically, those are the. I just want to show you some of the images that have been done. This is mostly is coming from place I've done my own community engagement. That's in the island of Nau in Lomaiviti in Fiji. Years ago, we started to plant mangroves in the hope of providing that habitat that often is on attack by people, because they are very important to coastal fisheries. Mangroves take a while to take off. Maybe the middle picture is, I think, about mangroves about 3 years old by then. Then the to the far end, there is the University of South Pacific boat by a fully grown mangrove. Interestingly, a lot of the villages did not see the change that clump of mangrove made to the coast. And that's the set of the pictures on the bottom. Over the years of going there, I was monitoring the change to the coastline. Mangroves is a natural seawall, so it gathers sand because it slows down the flow of the waves and therefore allow for settlement of sediments. So after about 10 to 12 years, there was no more gap between the coast and the land. I guess come up in they have joined together, and that is encouraged the rest of the villages who are living in places that are highly eroded or have highly eroding coastlines to consider planting mangroves. But mangroves do require certain conditions, and that needs to be fulfilled in order to get it. Next slide, please. And so, driven by the success of that one provable instance, other villages around the island. And now I'm very happy because the children are involved. They'll be around for much longer than us. They are aware of the importance of healthy environment to the fishery, whether we're doing aquaculture or still doing wild fishery. That still is the case. We need to have a healthy environment, and you can look at the sediments that is there on this coastline that is being planted with mangroves by these school pupils. Because of extension of farmland, farming activities on land, we are very careless about what comes down through the rivers. Eventually, that ends up on the coastline. If they are not captured there effectively, most of those sediments would find their way to the reefs, and that's not very healthy for the coral reefs. Next slide. So we've done some communities on now have done some farming of seaweed, and often seaweed is planted in areas where they have sand. But look, after seaweed is the crop matures after 8 weeks. So by about 8 weeks, the first picture shows what it would look like out at sea. And the point I'm trying to get here is that one, having the seaweed there provides some grazing spots for fish like rabbit fish and other grazers that live on algae and seagrass and all the marine plants. The story to me from the colleagues in now is that you can do both while you are maintaining the farm. Your fishing line or your fishing net alongside the fish farm can catch the fish for you to take home when you finish. Again, for coastal villages very far from urban areas, it was a very good source of income. But I think the problem over the years in Fiji has been is tied to the market or the lack of good stable market, and the prices have fluctuated, making it very difficult for the farmers or the women that were involved to justify continuing the involvement in this. But the point is that there you've seen it. It can be done even at the local village level, and the government, Fiji government, has been good over the years. It provided support through outboard motors and pumps for those that need to go some distance out to the sea, to their farming spots. But yeah, certainly it still is worrying that after I think about 4 trials or 4 cycles of introduction in Fiji, we still don't have the kind of support that we are hoping would be taken up by people who now seriously need to start thinking about sources of livelihood after wild fishing, because yeah, a lot of wild fisheries are getting to show the impacts of extensive, intensive use. Next slide. I think that maybe is the last. Okay, so these are just 3 other activities. You know, as I said earlier, a lot of aquaculture initiatives have been tried in Fiji. Even with the communities in now, we've tried this. We borrowed some giant clams from Makongai, and because all of the 16 villages had agreed to have protected areas, we placed this introduced giant clams from Makongai in those spots. This is the result. The bottom picture shows the baby clams all around the clam that was artificially put in. Again, it shows that if we allow time for living things to grow and to do their business, to reproduce, we can still have a sustained supply of food. We don't have we don't have serious food security issues in the Pacific, but I think this generation of Pacific Islanders should now start to think about what we need to do to ensure that our future generations don't run out of food. The picture in the middle is that of a homegrown fish aggregation device. This device is used in the open ocean to gather together tuna to allow for all kinds of fishing. But in this case, it is basically an attempt to try and share the load between inshore fisheries or the use of reef fisheries with the use of pelagics that are swimming freely in the open sea. So you use that structure, which after about 2 weeks begin to have algae on them, and that would attract the grazers. And of course, when the grazers go there, the carnivores will come following, and they establish a kind of a community, as is shown on the bottom picture, where the fishes can go and just hook up to the FED, the fish aggregation device, and do fishing and not waste their fuel roaming around trolling in order to get a catch. Then the last picture is in one of the villages, they in their protected, or the area that they've designated as management area, protected area, that they stay away from. They then erected a fence, and then inside they placed beach dimmer. I've seen this technology used in Berata and a few other places around Fiji. But the picture on the bottom shows all of the beach dimmer. See, beach dimmer, they need to, in order to reproduce, they release their eggs separately, and then it's up to the waves to bring the eggs together. So by having the mature animals in the enclosure enhances that product, that process of mating. The fertilized egg will then be taken by the current and be deposited anywhere outside of the enclosure, maybe inside, but that's a totally different picture. The idea is to try and use the understanding of the lifestyle of these animals to make sure we enhance their reproduction and therefore their chance to reproduce, because we need these animals to do their business in order for us to have the source of food that we need for the years to come. And just the last slide, I would hope this set of slides can be shared with those that are interested. But I've put in there some of the on the publications on our journey in terms of trying to engage communities in ensuring that the food supply we currently enjoy is shared with those that come after us in years to come. Thank you very much.
Naksarvale, Dr. Choeli Vitayaki. For everyone that missed out, that was Dr. Choeli Vitayaki, the director for the International Ocean Institute Pacific Island and co-chair of the Korea South Pacific Ocean Forum. Thank you for that very, very interesting presentation. For one, I'm very, very interested because that's one of mangroves is my area of research for my master's thesis. And I will be looking up to most of your work to refer to. So thank you, sir, for being a beacon of hope for us upcoming researchers. Just a kind reminder to everyone that's participating this afternoon, please, there's a link that Mr. Leather has shared on the chat box. Click onto that link to receive a participation certificate and to thank you for attending this webinar. Questions addressed to our speakers, if you can specify to whom your questions is for, so it will be easier for us to relate the questions to which one of the two speakers. And thirdly, please, AIS and UNDP are hosting a startup weekend, and for more information, please log into their official website or log into, you can check their social media platforms. So now we'll head into right into the questions to both of the speakers. What are some, I'll ask Mr. Jamie to answer this first. What are some of the major causes to the spike of seaweed, and what are some of the major causes sorry, the question was repeated. What are some of the major causes to the spike of seaweed production in Kiribati in 2012, and what causes it to fall in 2013? Mr. Jamie Whitford, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sulate. For Kiribati, the spike in production was a little bit earlier than what you mentioned in the 2000s. There was a sustained government effort that was supported by aid from England, and I think that was probably the main thing, that the Kiribati government had set up their own seaweed company, and most of the growers could funnel their seaweed into that company. But then I think in Kiribati, it wasn't so much market orientated, or the market didn't cause the disruption to the production. They had certain biological issues in many lagoons. I mentioned one of them with El Nino causing the wind direction to change. And so a lot of the seaweed farms that had been established on sites that were quite good and productive, with the change in wind direction, became quite exposed. And so, yeah, so that large shift in wind direction was a big problem in Kiribati. Global warming has also had an effect. Of course, Kiribati is one of the hottest countries in the Pacific. I lived there for a while. It's very hot. And the ocean temperature, particularly in the shallows where the seaweed had grown, made the seaweed susceptible to various diseases. And so there were problems then with just I guess the latitude of Kiribati. And we tried to rectify that, or Kiribati has tried to rectify that in conjunction with its partners by bringing in different strains that are more temperature tolerant. So yeah, for Kiribati particularly, I think there was an environmental impact that was quite high that caused the loss of production, which is different to Fiji, where I think it was more the economics of production caused the problems in Fiji, with the price not being competitive enough and some of the buyers dropping out of the system. And then it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. And so if the buyers aren't actively involved and the price is fluctuating, the production will go down, but then the buyers will become less interested because the production is fluctuating, and so the availability of the crop is not so good. So yeah, no, it's interesting to have two countries so close together, experiencing kind of a different scenario that has caused problems for them.
Thank you, Mr. Jamie Whitford. Dr. Choweli Vitayaki, can I ask you the same question? What are some of the major causes to the spike of seaweed production in Kiribati in 2012, and what caused it to fall in 2015? The floor is yours.
I'm really not so sure. I have no idea, Salat. Sorry.
I believe that question was for Mr. Jamie Whitford. Our next question directed to Mr. Whitford. Does global warming affect seaweed farming, and how can we help?
Certainly, yeah, it does affect seaweed farming, particularly for, as I said, countries that are right on the equator. SPC from the Philippines. Yeah. And so because production is effort from scientists over there to produce new strains, particularly of Capoficus, the cotton seaweed, that's of interest to the export market. And so we need to invest in the Pacific, I think, in our own genetic capability to try and breed strains that are more appropriate to the Pacific. And so we kind of rely on the production of Southeast Asia, but in future, I think we need to harness the power of the scientists that the Pacific is producing and trying to establish genetic strains that are more appropriate to the environments that we have. So yeah, global warming certainly is an issue for seaweed production, but it is possible to circumvent the effect, as I said, by new genetic strains of the species that is currently being grown, or some investigation into the value of some of the species that are endemic to the Pacific. That there may be other seaweeds of great value across the world under our noses that we really have to explore the potential for growing that seaweed that belongs to the country and is adapted to the environment.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Jamie Whitford. Dr. Choweli Vitayaki, one of our listeners tonight asked, how can we implement a seaweed farm in islands such as Batiki and Lomaiviti?
Well, certainly just getting the group together, and as Jamie has mentioned, secure the seedlings or the cuttings. Of course, you need to decide on the type of method, seaweed farming method to be used. A lot of the most common used method in places where people have farmed off the smart sand flat is basically just to have the poles and then have the lines attached to those poles. So if I'm sure it can also be done in areas that are deeper, maybe just have floats and then you have the lines. The challenge with the setting up of the farm is to make sure you take into consideration the current flow, because you would like your line to be aligned to the flow of the current rather than to be against it. Because remember, once the seaweed gets bigger, the weight will be great, and you don't want the seaweed to break off the string and then fall on the sand, because or the coral, because that basically means it's wasted. But good thing, there are manuals. I think there are manuals available for cultivating seaweed. And I suppose I think both Jamie and I agree that one of the biggest challenges to farming of seaweed, even though it's so popular amongst rural villages, it relates to the price and the market. So maybe before anyone goes off to get the thing organized, they should try and, this was part of the research that I was talking about earlier. We need to gather our data and seek advice where those things can be provided in order to be well equipped with information that what we're going to do, we've covered the bases properly as much as we can, and that we will succeed. And then, yeah, for islands like Batiki, I think it would certainly offer a new welcome source of income for villages. And as I said earlier, 8 weeks you plant, and after 8 weeks you get to harvest. But yeah, it's important to get the market end of the equation sorted out, and the price to make sure that whatever the effort is put in is paid off in the terms of the return.
Thank you, Dr. Chueli. My next question is directed for Mr. Jamie Whitford. Who produces the most seaweed in the Pacific?
At the moment, the Solomon Islands is in front. So yeah, I believe that they've put a lot of effort recently. They problems I mentioned, the Solomons like Fiji and Kiribati as well, is quite a disparate country with lots of islands and lots of access problems. But again, there's been to work together to form clusters. And so at the moment, the Solomons is doing quite well, and also Papua New Guinea. In the past, as I mentioned, Kiribati produced a lot. There was one atoll in Kiribati, Fanning Island, which is close to Hawaii, that I think produced 100,000 tons from a community, I think, of 500 or 600 people. Again, a while ago now, in the 2000s. And so when, as Professor Jolie said, the market is lining up and the stars align, yeah, it's very, very popular and can be quite lucrative in the context of the GDP of the countries.
I think that's a statement everyone is waiting to hear. The stars aligned and the prizes. My next question, Dr. Chueli with Ayaki. What are some of the incentives that women have to farm seaweed in the region? What are some incentives? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, certainly, for me, I think a lot of the incentives relate to the points that been made earlier about getting the planting material. Some of the governments have also offered some of the materials that are required, like the lines and you know the strings that are needed for farming seaweed. And then there is the issue of marketing, the issue of price. All of these details need to be gathered from maybe the ministries, the relevant ministries. I think I've been following the Ministry of Women in Fiji, for instance, has been providing a lot of support for women involvement in economic activities like fishing and agriculture. So that would be the place to seek advice and information from.
Thank you, Dr. Chirley. My next question is directed from Mr. Jamie Whitford. Do you know of any companies that buy seaweed locally on the Pacific region? And how can, specifically in Fiji, how can Fijians take advantage of the international market? Any recommendations from your experiences, any companies within Fiji?
It's my belief there's still one company in Fiji. I don't have the name of it in front of me, but I will supply it. Yeah, and I think it must be a company that's buying various commodities. There were three, is my understanding, and now just one, but I can find out the name for you and I'll supply it. I guess really accessing international markets as an individual is quite difficult. Which again, this is why SPC is looking at domestic markets and different species like Galerpa and the Mazuka seaweed in Tonga. A little bit more easy to do when you can access domestic markets, and so you can be a smaller operator. You don't have to put so much effort into this distribution problem. But I believe the buyer in Fiji is still interested in buying seaweed. But they complain that the production volume varies quite a bit. It makes it difficult for them to supply their buyers a consistent quality. But I'll try and get the name of the company for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Jamie. Next to Dr. Chirley, what are the ideal conditions for seaweed farming? And does temperature of the seawater affect seaweed growth? And I think the main issue here that this participant is asking is because of increasing surface water temperatures. Will it affect global warming in terms of climate change in the Pacific, as we are situated geographically located close to the equator? Does it affect seaweed farming? Like, is this a promising area to invest in, or would you not recommend it?
Well, I mean, every living thing is going to be affected by the rising temperatures, and those in the sea will be included in that. So perhaps with that, Jamie, I think had mentioned the research being done on more tolerant varieties, those that can withstand the warmer waters much better, and perhaps there may be some new varieties that can be found to do much better under those the conditions. At the moment, as I was mentioning earlier, perhaps most of the fishers, most of the farmers are using the sand and mud flat, and there's a condition that the seaweed should never be exposed above the water, even at low tide. So if it is exposed to the elements, it actually is harmed. So maybe an idea would be to move into deeper waters where hopefully it will be cooler. But yeah, the research has to be done as to where our limits are in terms of how far into the depth we can go, and in order to secure that optimum condition that we want our crops to live under. So that's a whole new set of interesting research topics for our listeners.
Thank you, Dr. Choweli. My next question is directed to Mr. Jamie Whitford. What effect does the cultivation of seaweed have on the marine environment or on the ecosystem as a whole, and how can we work around the effects that you will mention?
Seaweed farming tends to have a positive effect, and so most of the nutrient runoff from land that causes a problem for the marine environment involves phosphorus and nitrogen, and both of these chemicals are food for seaweed, and so they uptake nitrogen and phosphorus that's released from land, from effluent. We do have to be a little bit careful because seaweed also uses oxygen. And so if we're in places where oxygen is in short supply, it's possible for seaweed farming to deplete oxygen and then cause problems with the production, particularly of hydrogen sulfide, because the bacteria in the sediment will switch their metabolic pathways when oxygen is not available. And hydrogen sulfides, as most of us know, is quite poisonous to many marine organisms. But I think that's quite unlikely in most farms. The depletion of oxygen tends to be encountered when we have blooms of not seaweed, but their relative microalgae, which is a single-celled seaweed that's floating in the water column. And so many people have heard of algal blooms that are causing these problems. For me, seaweed is almost certainly going to have a positive effect with that one condition that I mentioned in uptaking nutrients that are released from the land. I guess the other impact that many people realise that because the seaweed farms take up space on the sea floor, that tends to restrict the movement of boats and may restrict fishing activity. But as Professor Jordi said, fish are usually attracted to seaweed farms. So if the seaweed farms are planned quite well, fishing activity around the seaweed farm is probably quite productive and also benefit for the seaweed because many of the fish caught are grazing on the seaweed. So mainly positive effects with those two conditions, the possibility of the reduction of oxygen, quite likely, unlikely I mean, but something to keep in mind. And the competition for seafloor space for any other activities that the communities might be involved in.
Thank you, Mr. Jamie Whitford, for that answer. I apologize. The questions keep rolling in because we have approximately 240 participants. I thought it was going to, just keeps coming. So I apologize. Yeah, this is a very popular platform at the moment. Okay, so bear with us. My next question is directed to Dr. Choweli Vitayaki. What have you found from your experience with seaweed aquaculture beds, SABs? I believe it's one of the research studies you've done, and other forms of farming in terms of carbon sequestration potential and the use of seaweed for biofuel. If you want me to repeat the question, I can do so.
Yeah, just I missed a bit of in the middle part of the thing. Can you just repeat that?
Yes, there's two parts to the question. One is, what have you found from your experience with seaweed aquaculture beds, SABs, and other forms of farming in terms of the carbon sequestration potential and the use of seaweed biofuel?
Well, I feel that these are possibilities and things that still need to be looked at carefully. But you know, in terms of having seaweed planted, as we have discussed this evening, it offers a whole new range of activities that are often under threat, serious threat in fishing grounds. I'm talking about you know, the damage to seagrass beds and seaweed. The fact that we are artificially culturing this can help maybe get some balance to what is naturally disappearing as a result of our fishing activities. And well, if the opportunity is made feasible for biofuel, it would be even better. But I think at the moment, even just providing the supply that is needed by the industry for all the uses that Jamie shared for seaweed products. There's a long way to go for us. I mean, one of the problems with the seaweed farming in Fiji is that the production is often low. So when that is the case, then you enter into this chicken and egg situation, which should be addressed first. Grow more seaweed before the service, the support service gets better, or get the support service better first, and the market included. So it's that kind of, and it's interesting situation. Because like in the case of Fiji, as I mentioned, we've tried on more than 4 occasions to get the seaweed farming operation you know, to thrive, but it seems to you know, I remember the last time I went to Maduata, and there was a lot of Mel was one of the participants. We saw a lot of fishing. I mean, a lot of seaweed boats in this village in Maduata. But unfortunately, my relatives in Vanuatu were using it to roam around to Lambasa rather than do the farming that the boat was supposed to be used for. So the next time we came around, about half of the boats have disappeared, repossessed by the funding agency. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that we face. I'm mentioning Honolulu because I'm related to the people there. But the point is that when
I believe it's only Honolulu because that's my Togo.
Once the support is given by government in this case, it needs to be used for the purpose for which it was given, and it's that kind of those kinds of dilemmas that affect the performance of the industry.
Thank you, Dr. Choweli Vitayaki. My next question is addressed to Mr. Jamie Whitford. How about the seaweed that is being exported to Japan from Tonga? Can this seaweed be grown in Fiji as well?
Yes, it can. I believe it's probably endemic and exists there. I suspect it's being eaten as well, but I don't know for sure, and so I can confer with my colleague, Dr. Tim Pickering, who knows quite a bit about seaweed in Fiji. But certainly it would be my expectation that it's certainly in Fiji and the export market would be available. but also, as I pointed out, it would be nutritious food. And if it's not in the Fijian diet, certainly it could be wise to make efforts to introduce it or to encourage its use for people to eat.
Thank you, Mr. Jamie Whitford. To Dr. Joel Vitayaki, is there a seaweed farming project that Fijians from the outer islands can join, and how can they have access to seaweed farming manuals?
Our fisheries ministry would, I'm sure, be very happy to provide the answers to the questions. But I do know that the manuals have been around for a while. I mean, they should have it at the ministry if people are interested in getting copies. I also may have seen, I have to be corrected, but I thought IUCN also had some booklets. It was mostly, I think, targeting the involvement of women, trying to encourage the involvement of women. So, and these are the things that we can do. So I suppose I'm more than happy to look for the information and share it with those that can get in touch with me by email. Or even Jamie may be able to direct us to the experts.
Mr. Jamie Whitford has been very quiet. I'm sure he has so much more to offer, but he's quiet about it.
No, we do. So we do have material available at SPC. We have some material in Pidgin and some material in Ikiribas, Gilbertese. And so there are manuals available through SPC, and I can provide the person to contact for that.
Thank you, Mr. Jamie Whitford. And if we didn't push that question to Mr. Jamie Whitford, I don't think he'd come out with that information. Thank you, sir, for cooperating.
No, I would. I guess I'm a bit constrained by my location at the moment. I don't have it on me.
I'm joking. Okay. Dr. Vitayaki, your next question is, Dr. Choeli, one question from CBM, Ortonom Dokai, Ortonatau, Vanoliabu customary foreshore, customary fishing grounds. Is there any rate of carbon desolation or attraction rate per acre or hectare of mangrove fishery in Fiji or the Pacific? And this is an interest area in terms of mitigation and the compensation valuation of the destruction of mangrove forestry for development purpose in Fiji, especially here in Vanoliabu. One paragraph, the question that was sent in. So if you want me to repeat, I understand.
No, it's okay, because I think there is I just got to learn of this about 2 weeks back. There's a research by CSIRO and a local partner that doing a study up in Maduata somewhere, basically trying to do this this study. So I can, if maybe people can send emails, I can share the information to. But certainly, the importance of mangroves in relation to the question that was asked is noted. And we certainly should easily be able to get some figures from some of the studies that have been done.
Yes, Dr. Choeli, I'm sure the support team that's working behind the curtain, they will, once the information that you have forwarded, they will probably have, they will have the participants' email addresses, and it can be forwarded to them after this webinar.
Okay.
My next question is directed to Mr. Jamie Whitford. Seaweeds, does it grow throughout the year or is it seasonal?
It depends on the location. Like most things in the ocean, it grows in conjunction with the temperature that's available to it. And so it will grow faster at higher temperatures unless the temperature becomes too high, and then it has trouble coping with it, and then it will die. It's my belief that in certain locations it would be a year-round crop. I think the experience in Kiribati was that production will reduce, not particularly related to temperature there, but related to storm activity and related to the seasonal cycle of storms in that location where the wind direction reverses. I forget the time of year. And so, seaweed production is probably limited when the weather is stormy or when there is sediment in the water, or it is faster when the temperature is higher, but not too high.
Thank you, Mr. Jamie Whitford. Dr. Choweli, so the switching of villages from seaweed farming to a more valuable coastal resource, like beach timber that you have mentioned in your presentation, drop in production capacity leading to market uncertainties. How do we keep the interest of seaweed farming? Can this be helped by the government support through funding and more exposure to export markets?
Can you just go through that first part of the question again, Saloti?
In your presentation, you mentioned that some of the villages switched from seaweed farming to a more valuable coastal resource farming like beach timber because there was a drop in production capacity due to the market uncertainties. So the question is, how do we keep the interest in seaweed farming? And can this be helped by government support through funding and more exposure to export markets?
Well, and I also mentioned that in a number of cases, government actually had provided the support that it could, but then people were too free to leave the industry, like too flexible to leave the industry and go to do something else. And even the case I was mentioning about the use of motorboats, the seawood boats, they were supposed to be used for going to the farm, collecting the products from the farm. But people use them to go fishing and to go visiting relatives in other parts of Vanuatu and Lomoiviti and everywhere else. So basically, for people to treat it like the business that it is, and people need to realize the commitment by, say, in this case, the government to offer the assistance. So, the point that I mentioned about the number of fishing boats that disappeared after a short while because they could not repay their loan and their boat was taken back. That has been with the industry for as long as the industry has been there. Sadly, some people make use of the project equipment as a means to do something that they had wanted to do all this time but did not have the means. So the seaweed boat became like the carrier to go from one village to another, one island
Public
to
transport.
another, or even to use it for fishing, for fin fishing. And I said to the people that I've talked to, I said, you see, you've been fin fishing all this time, you never were able to get a boat. The boat has been given for seaweed if you if you are truthful to that, you may get even something better. But don't spoil this opportunity or this support that you are enjoying just because it's allowed you to have an outboard so that you can go roam around. It was given for a purpose. You need to pay your loan and then get on to something better than that. That cannot be obtained or attained until you've succeeded with your seafood farming operation. So it's a combination of things. I mean, government has done its part in a lot of cases. It's often the local villages who not very committed to it.
Okay.
The other thing is that seaweed needs to be looked after much more than other things. So you can't afford to stay off your farm, say 1 week, because you're having a big soil level in the village. So it's that kind of thing. It is a very, very useful, accessible source of livelihood for our people, but people need to give it the serious attention that it requires.
I definitely agree with you there, Dr. Chiweli. My next question is for Mr. Jamie Whitford. What is the best approach to ensure that environmental pollution does not affect the growth of aquaculture?
Sure. No, it's a difficult one. And so, yeah, aquaculture is dependent on a pristine environment often. Although some species,
I'm not sure if it's just me or Dr. Chiweli. Can you hear Mr. Jamie Whitford?
Tolerate
Sorry, Mr. Jamie Whitford, you're breaking.
Species worldwide, like catfish, environmental conditions are relatively okay. I'll just stop my video.
Okay,
is it better without my video?
perfect.
Okay, that's good. I can eat my dinner now too.
Multitasking, just like the level boats. Good.
I'll start from the beginning. Aquaculture is quite dependent on good environmental conditions. Some species do tolerate worse environmental conditions, particularly some fish like catfish and tilapia. And this is kind of part of the reason why they are the producers of most of the tonnage of aquaculture worldwide, because they're resistant animals to bad conditions. But as I said, seaweed farming also can tolerate what many species may call bad conditions. High levels of nitrogen and phosphorus are quite valuable for seaweed in its metabolic life, and so it's consuming these pollutants, but it must have the availability of oxygen to make sure it's okay. And so if coastal conditions are really, really bad, then we find a lack of oxygen will preclude the growth of nearly anything. And that's when we have these benthic or bottom dead zones that can crop up in certain places that are close to bad pollution. So yeah, it's very important for aquaculture and all food production to make sure that we do not try and degrade the coastal environment, because that's the resource that the Pacific is to this stage holding in reserve, ready for its aquaculture production to increase when markets are established and more accessible, or domestic markets increase their capacity for some of these products. And so, yeah, without the environment, aquaculture will not be successful, and the Pacific will lose one of its greatest resources that it has in reserve for the future.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jamie Whitford. From the team, please, my apologies. There are like 25 to 30 questions that are still left hanging, and I apologize to the participants that forwarded those questions. I will try and see our way around it. Unfortunately, time has caught up on us, and we have less than 5 minutes left. So I will just say a big Vinakapakalebo, Tanya Tumas, Tanya Vad, Malo Pito, to everyone that attended. We had more than a total of approximately 242 attendees today. So thank you so much for coming in, putting aside some of your valuable time to be a part of this UNDP AIS forum webinar. And thank you to my brothers and sisters joining in from Tonga, Kiribati, Samoa, Cook Islands, Hawaii, New Zealand, Australia, and Cook Islands. A special thank you to AIS and UNDP Indonesia, SPC, and USP. Please check out the AIS forum social media pages. You can find them on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And from the team, Dr. Chireli Bitayaki and Mr. James Whitford, thank you so much. Thank you so much for putting aside your time to share your area of expertise. And words will never be enough to thank you for sharing your experiences with us to help us through these hard times. So from the team, thank you so much from everyone that's coming in live, and we're also live on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. Tau, Mr.
Thank you.
Jamie,
Thank you.
Mitaki, bro. We pray that the Lord will continue to bless you, so your work and your studies and your research will flourish, just as the seaweeds and the mangroves are flourishing during this time. Any closing statements from Dr. Vitaki will go first, and then Mr. Jamie Whitford. Any closing remarks or statements that you would like to share?
Yes, just that life is going to get even more interesting, and we need all hands on deck to try and look for solutions for our communities and our countries. And all the very best to each and everyone that have dedicated the hour to join us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chireli Bitayaki. Mr. Jamie Whitford, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wish everyone good luck in these trying times. But I think one thing that we can see from the state of the world at the moment, that self-sufficiency and perhaps returning to some of these traditional ways and looking at what we can do locally is very important, of course, now. And I believe the Pacific certainly has the capacity for that, and is showing that actually through this crisis. Thank you kindly.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jamie Whitford. To the participants that still haven't clicked onto the link that was shared by Ms. Tali Daudau to get your participation certificate for attending this webinar, please do so. You can have that joined into your CV and make your CV look colorful. And we apologize again for the questions, for not having enough time. Thank you to everyone that attended. And if you are interested in the AIS UNDP Startup Weekends, please, for more information, go into their website or their social media platforms through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. From the team, from the panelists, and from all the participations from around the Pacific and the world, thank you so much for joining in this afternoon. Mr. Chireli Bitayaki and Mr. Jamie Whitford, God bless you.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
The Archipelagic and Island States Forum is a platform designed to facilitate 47 archipelagic and island nations to collaborate and cooperate in addressing common challenges in 4 thematic areas: climate change mitigation and adaptation, blue economy, marine plastic debris, and good maritime governance. In 2017, The idea to establish the multinational cooperation framework among the archipelagic and island states was first iterated during the UN Ocean Conference in New York. In November 2018, Indonesia hosted the first ministerial meeting with 21 archipelagic and island states. The Archipelagic and Island States Forum was established by Manando Joint Declaration. In the following year, the second ministerial meeting adopted the final outcome with 25 AIS participating countries. To achieve our vision, we focus on 4 objectives which we translate into our programs. Create an open, innovative, and engaging forum. Provide a space to share and implement innovative and tangible programs. Promote collaborative efforts among stakeholders. And create opportunity through the blue economy. Ideation, implementation, and evaluation are the core elements to our solution framework in addressing the problems. In 2020, AIS Forum launched programs to drive innovation, which are AIS Joint Research, a collaborative applied research program affiliated with academic institutions in AIS countries with various topics related to the 4 areas of collaboration. The Innovator Scholarship Program, a fully funded exchange program for talented individuals from AIS participating countries who demonstrate exceptional leadership quality and creative mind, and AIS Innovation Challenge, to find innovative ideas and breakthroughs that can help societies and businesses to be more resilient and adaptive during crisis situations. AIS Forum also launched AIS Blue Startup Hub, a platform to connect marine-focused startup in 47 archipelagic and island states across the globe. AIS Blue Startup Hub Mentoring Program was launched with 18 participating startups from 6 countries. As an effort to realize the smart, innovative solutions, AIS Forum also engaged with public audiences through online events in a form of trainings, workshops, talk shows, and discussions with various topics and stakeholders across AIS participating countries. In light of COVID-19 pandemic, it is important for archipelagic and island states to have a resilient economy. Therefore, AIS Forum Secretariat introduces programs which focuses on blue economy. As a form of its commitment, AIS Forum developed Blue Economy Development Index, or BEDI. This index will be used as a tracking tool to determine the current use of coastal and marine resources, and it can be used as a tool to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Blue Financing Framework, or BFF, which provides a guidance for governments, financial institutions, philanthropists, and donors to align their investments with the blue economy principles and allow them to select a project to be financed in the blue economy sectors. Smart and innovative solution programs, such as sharing knowledge sessions with experts and representatives from AIS participating countries. Plankton, which was a competition to raise awareness in reducing marine plastic debris. Impact pitching, which connects startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, potential investors, and growth enablers to gain partnership. And Ending Plastic Pollution Innovation Challenge, which was a collaboration with Marine Plastic Debris Project from UNDP Indonesia to address marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. Many solutions to challenges that affect AIS participating countries in 4 main thematic areas and SDG 14 goals are produced through collaboration programs. These programs will explore opportunities through innovation and experiment that benefits on a local, regional, and international scale through sharing knowledge and experiences between AIS participating countries.